My name is Mark, a recording angel. I've been observing this earth since the dawn of creation. The Most High has asked me to share my recordings with you. The following are my records of the church's early years and earliest believers, not just adults, but children too, collected in this book, Champions of the King, the Story of the Apostles. If today's recording contains situations which might be uncomfortable for younger listeners, I will mark the video with the words parental guidance recommended. Elihu ben Malchus, Cyprus. Another day, another town.
Hey, we have our own son of Jesus here.
Someone shouted at Paul from the crowd. Yes, Elimus bar Jesus, others echoed.
But Jesus of Nazareth, Saul protested, was the Son of God. He could do miracles. Jesus healed the sick and even raised the dead.
Well, our son of Jesus can do all kinds of miracles too, a townsperson exclaimed. You need to meet him. He's powerful.
But Jesus of Nazareth, Saul continued.
The crowd shouted him down. Get Elimus! Get Elimus bar Jesus!
Let him meet our son of Jesus!
By now no one could hear Saul. The crowd started chanting,
Elimus! Elimus! Elimus!
Soon an entourage approached the crowd. It was Elimus. As he neared Saul, someone shouted out, Preacher of Jesus of Nazareth, meet Elimus, son of Jesus! The evangelist nodded to the man. Elimus put his hand out, and suddenly gold coins appeared in it. He threw them to the cheering crowd.
It's your turn, Saul. What can you do? They shouted. What kind of power did Jesus of Nazareth give you?
Saul remained silent. Reaching toward the evangelist, Elimus seemed to pull some small, sweet cakes from behind the preacher's shoulder.
That's an unusual place to keep your lunch,
he said. The crowd roared, and he tossed the treats to the crowd.
This man is just a showman, Saul proclaimed, a magician. Jesus of Nazareth is a god.
Elimus is our prophet, someone said from the crowd.
He's no prophet, Saul retorted. He is a cheap magician.
A brawl appeared about to break out. Soldiers appeared on the periphery. What's the problem here? Demanded the officer in charge.
It's a contest of powers, someone explained. Yes, between Jesus of Nazareth and Elimus bar Jesus,
another added. No, it's not Jesus of Nazareth, it's this Saul person, a third individual interrupted.
Well, save it for the proconsul, the officer said. He wants to meet this Saul person anyway, as one of his advisors. You know he's fond of you, Elimus. Let's all head back to the palace, where we can settle this in a civilized way.
Fine with me,
Elimus agreed. He turned to Saul.
I am at the palace frequently. Have you ever been there?
Saul looked like a thundercloud. Elihu's stomach twisted into a knot. Now he was going to see the inside of the palace, but was it a good thing? He wasn't sure. When at the palace, Saul received permission to speak. He started to tell the story of Jesus of Nazareth to the proconsul. Over on the side, Elimus kept making comments that the little evangelist could not quite hear, but that made everyone around the magician laugh. Suddenly, Saul turned to him and said, You work for the devil. Every night you stay up inventing schemes to cheat people out of God, but now you've come up against him yourself. For that you are about to go blind for a while, unable to see even the sun. Elimus smiled and said, Ha! But it ended in a high-pitched squeak, and suddenly his hand shot out.
Help me, he cried. Help me, I can't see. Something's happened, I can't see.
While Elimus's friends clustered around him to soothe his panic, Saul waited patiently.
Why don't you lead him to some place where he can sit down? He may want to hear this, he said after a few minutes.
Then Saul gave his complete sermon, uninterrupted. The proconsul appeared impressed. So were Mark and Elihu. Afterward they asked him,
How did you do that, Saul? I didn't. I was just praying and asking God what I should do, and he told me.
That's great, Elihu said.
So, how is the writing coming? Saul asked him, trying to change the subject. I've seen you scratching away there, and you filled up 1 or 2 scrolls. Why don't you read some of it to us?
I don't want to do that, Mark stammered. Oh, come on, Barnabas insisted. We want to hear what you've written. You've been listening to all of Saul's sermons now. By now you must have many of them recorded. This really isn't a good time, the young man stammered. Nonsense, boy. Get them out. Let's see what you've got. I'm not feeling very well, he mumbled. But he unrolled one of his scrolls and began to read. The good news of Jesus Christ, the message, begins here. Following to the letter, the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. Watch closely, I'm sending my preacher ahead of you. He'll make the road smooth for you. Thunder in the desert, prepare for God's arrival. Make the road smooth and straight. Mark 1:1-3. Message. Did I quote that passage from Isaiah? Saul asked, puzzled. Go on, Barnabas urged. John the Baptizer appeared in the wild, preaching a baptism of life change that leads to forgiveness of sins. People thronged to him from Judea and Jerusalem, and as they confessed their sins, were baptized by him in the Jordan River into a changed life. John wore a camel hair habit, tied at the waist with a leather belt. He ate locusts and wild field honey. Verses 4-6. Message. I never said that. Saul frowned. Mark stopped. Continue, Barnabas said. But that's nothing like what I have been preaching. Saul shook his head, a confused expression on his face. Keep reading, Barnabas insisted. Are you sure? Mark asked nervously. Yes, keep reading. As he preached, he said, The real action comes next. The star in this drama, to whom I'm a mere stagehand, will change your life. I'm baptizing you here in the river, turning your old life in for a kingdom life. His baptism, a holy baptism by the Holy Spirit, will change you from the inside out. At this time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. The moment he came out of the water, he saw the sky split open and God's Spirit, looking like a dove, come down on him. Along with the Spirit, a voice said,
You are my Son, chosen and marked by my love, pride of my life.
Verses 7-11. Message. But I have never told that story. That's not in any of my sermons, Saul protested. Barnabas turned to Saul. No, he said, but it is the story of Jesus of Nazareth. Isn't that what you wanted? Well, you said that your nephew was a scribe, and that he could write down some of my sermons, and we could circulate them among the new converts. And this is not what we discussed. No, it is not what we discussed. Mark, I just wanted to write the story of Jesus. Your sermons are good, but they're all theology and history, and why the Jews did this and the Jews did that, and why Jesus was the Messiah. By the time they're converts, they want to hear more about Jesus, not more of what they've already heard. As Saul jumped to his feet, Barnabas stood too. Now, let's think about this, Mark's uncle said. This could work. It could make good sense. After all, many people were with Jesus and knew him and saw him do a lot of things. It would be helpful to have a record of those stories. You might enjoy reading them. But it's not what we discussed, Saul replied. Your nephew hasn't done anything the way he was supposed to on this whole journey. He's young, afraid, and can't take our pace. I was looking for an assistant and a personal scribe, and this is not what I expected it to be. No, it's not, Mark said. None of it is what we discussed, and I'm not any happier than you are. He took a deep breath, shook his head, and said, I'm not cut out for this kind of traveling life. I don't want to be your personal scribe. I just want to write the stories of Jesus the way they happened. That is totally unacceptable. Saul started pacing back and forth. Totally unacceptable. I'm sure we can work this out, Barnabas replied, trying to soothe the upset evangelist. You are one of the greatest preachers in our whole movement, but Mark's idea has value too, and there is a place for that. There may be a place for both of us, Saul said after some moments, but I don't think it is together. Mark shook his head. No, not together. Barnabas sighed and thought for several minutes. Suppose I arrange passage for you back to Israel, Mark. Can you get back to Jerusalem on your own? The younger man nodded. We are almost to Pamphylia. There is a harbor there. I will find the ship for your trip. Please continue your writing. It is something that we need, and no one has put the story of Jesus into writing.
Perhaps there would be value someday in putting some of my words into writing, Saul muttered.
Barnabas turned to him. Yes, we will find you a scribe who will take down your words and send them to encourage the converts in the places we have been. Even when the Lord was here, he used many different types of people, and we didn't all get along either. So this shouldn't be shocking or feel like a failure to anyone. It's just the Lord's way, and we need to learn to work with it. This will probably not be the first time that people he has called to ministry disagree and have trouble getting along. I laughed out loud. God's people have always had conflicts with each other and have always had trouble getting along. Barnabas was quite correct. It always seemed to me that my job would be easier if God had more followers like Barnabas and fewer like Saul and Mark. However, if there were, the work would not get done in the same way, for after all, the Lord made special use of both Saul and young Mark. He has great patience with humans. The rest of the trip to the port was tense. Barnabas, true to his word, bought Mark passage on a ship bound for Joppa. From there, the young man would travel home to Jerusalem on his own. After bidding him goodbye, the other three boarded another ship bound for Perga. From there, they headed up to Pisidian, Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. It was a rough trip. Saul began to request that people now call him Paul.
"I'd like to take the name Paul," he said, "in honor of the governor, Sergius Paulus, who was very fair to us."
"Yes, he was," Elihu responded. "I wonder whatever happened to Elimas, Bar Jesus."
"I don't know, but from now on, please address me as Paul. Perhaps that will help me get away from the image of a persecutor, and more people will just listen to my message instead of worrying about what I used to be."
Barnabas smiled. "The Lord has forgiven everything you used to be, but if you would rather be called Paul, we would be happy to oblige you." The apostle launched into his preaching with new vigor in the town of Iconium. Soon the Jews in that town became furious and forced him to leave. While it was frightening, at least the missionaries encountered only the threat of violence.
"Couldn't you be more cautious, Paul?"
Elihu asked one day.
"More cautious?"
he replied incredulously.
"Well, not that you would water down the gospel or change anything that Jesus of Nazareth said, but you just make people so angry."
"I can't help it if they are angry at what I say. They got angry at Jesus too."
Elihu looked at Barnabas, who shrugged. "Some people will always be angry when someone presents truth to them," Barnabas said, "although there is a place for gentleness and diplomacy."
"I just preach it as it is," Paul muttered, pacing back and forth. "I just preach it as it is."
"That's true," Barnabas acknowledged.
"And many people have accepted the gospel,"
Paul protested. "And that's also true. But perhaps there's a way to preach it without making people want to attack you."
"Perhaps," Paul said slowly. I speak from the bottom of my heart. I mean every word I speak. But perhaps the two of us together?"
He looked at Barnabas imploringly. "Yes, that's why the two of us are together. We'll preach together at Lystra, the next village along that road. Perhaps team preaching together will work better."
"I certainly hope so,"
Elihu whispered under his breath,
"because this is getting scary."
As they approached the town of Lystra, they noticed a crippled man sitting by the gate. He heard Paul talking and looked at him. The evangelist walked over to him. Suddenly, Paul said in a loud voice,
"Stand up, on your feet."
At the same time, he pulled the man to his feet. To his amazement, the crippled man stood. Even when Paul let go, he kept his balance. Then he took one tentative step, and still another. Suddenly he began jumping and laughing and shouting. "I can walk! I can walk! I've never been able to do this! Not since the day I was born! Praise the gods! This is wonderful!" People came streaming out of houses in the market to see what had happened. They all started shouting and chanting, "Praise the gods! The gods have come down! Praise the gods!" Because they were shouting in their own dialect, Paul and Barnabas were not exactly sure what the people were saying, so they smiled and nodded. It must be Zeus and Hermes come down. Zeus must be the tall, good-looking one, and Hermes the one who talks a lot. He must be his speaker, they said, pointing at Paul.
Get the priests from the temple of Zeus quick. Bring a bull. We must have a sacrifice immediately.
The people continued to cheer. It seemed only a few minutes until the priests from the local shrine had assembled a parade. It consisted of banners and bulls, and people dancing and shouting and getting ready for a sacrifice. "What are you doing?" Paul protested as he began to realize what was going on. "Stop this! No! Don't sacrifice a bull to us, and don't worship us. We are not gods." "No, no," Barnabas added. "I am not Zeus, nor is he Hermes." But the people didn't understand. Elihu wished his friend Mark were there. Having gotten separated from Paul and Barnabas in the crowd, he glanced around frantically. This was Lystra, the town where his aunt should be. How would he ever find her in the huge crowd among all the pandemonium? Suddenly, he noticed some men he had seen in Iconium. They went straight to the priest of Zeus and whispered to him, then the city elders. Instantly, the mood turned ugly. "They're imposters. They're not gods at all," the priest roared. "Stone them!" Then the same people who had moments before shouted praises to those they thought were gods were now angry. The crowd surrounded Paul and Barnabas. "Stop! Stop!" Elihu screamed. He threw himself against the mob, trying to get through to see what was happening, but he couldn't. Little did he know that the people he struggled against were guardians stationed all around him so that he would not be injured in the melee. Finally, he gave up and sat sobbing on the stone steps of the Acropolis. Unknown to him, the angry crowd dragged his two friends outside the city gates. "What's happening, God?" he begged. "Don't you see what's happening here? Paul can be very abrasive, but he's your servant. He's preaching about you. Aren't you going to protect him? Can't you send someone to rescue him?" As he sat lost in grief and panic, someone approached him. Embarrassed and depressed, he didn't even look up, but just rested his head on his knees. "You're a stranger here," a voice said. Elihu said nothing. "What brings you to our town? Do you have business here?" Still he didn't answer. "Come, come." The men shook him by the shoulders. "You can speak to me. No one will bother you. The crowd has left. They're outside the city walls right now, beating up those visitors. Are you with them?" Glancing up at the man, Elihu nodded. "Is your business here in this town just to cause a riot?" Elihu shook his head. "No, they're Christians. They've come to tell people about Jesus of Nazareth. But some of the Jews from Iconium who are angry with them there have followed them here. The people here are confused." "Yes, I know. They thought they were Zeus and Hermes. Are you a preacher too?" "Oh, no. They brought me here because I wasn't safe in Jerusalem. I have an aunt who lives here." "Really? What's her name?" She's married to a Greek man now. Her name was Eunice when she was at home with my mother." "Ah," the man said, "she married a Greek. Must have really upset your family." "Oh, I don't know. I guess when she married him it did. But now that my mother and I are Christians, we consider Jews and Greeks as equals." "Really? And you believe this?" Oh, yes. "Then I will take you to your Aunt Eunice. Your grandmother, Lois, is living with us too." Really? Living with us? Are you?" "I'm the Greek man that married your Aunt Eunice. Come, join us. We have a son your age. His name is Timothy. You two may get along pretty well." What about?" Elihu glanced toward the gate. "I can't do anything about that right now, but I can get you out of here before they return. Now, we should be moving." "Yes, sir." Elihu jumped to his feet and followed his newfound uncle home. This broadcast has come from the book Champions of the King by Sally Pierson Dillon, with permission from the Review and Herald Publishing Association. This book and the rest of the series, War of the Ages, can be purchased by going to www.adventistbookcenter.com or by calling 1-800-765-6955. I'm your narrator, Austin Backus, and this audio project is a gift to you from my free Christian book ministry, RXF 1888. Please visit our website, www.rxf1888.com, to request free Christian books for both kids and adults. And join us here again for more stories from Mark the Recording Angel.